Now, I saw some people walk in late. I do have handouts for everybody. No, not a criticism, just an observation. All right, I think I have enough. If you need a clipboard, there's some clipboards over there. If you would like one. Oh, I'm sorry, Neva. So Neva wasn't here. Neva wasn't here late, and I still missed her, so that's on me. All right. Okay. So we're on lesson 6 of our series, and last week this is actually not the conclusion, but it's kind of the conclusion of kind of the, science-y portion of our series, is this lesson. Last week we talked about divine design, and kind of from like the cosmological perspective, like from the big grand scheme of things, about how God has created a fine-tuned universe, and because God has created a fine-tuned universe, that we can see that didn't happen by accident. If it didn't happen by accident, it happened with a purpose, and if it happened with a purpose, that means that God exists and that He did it intentionally. And so that was our lesson last week. This week we're going to kind of like come out from like way up here, and we're going to kind of come down in, and we're going to talk specifically about life. All right, about how life began, and the problems. Really what we're going to talk about today is the problems with evolution, and where that kind of fits in with Scripture, where that fits in with kind of our whole argument of the existence of God. And so we're going to go through this. Now, I'm going to preface this. This is actually 2 lessons in 1 lesson, all right? And if you have been part of our first 5 lessons, you know that an hour I struggle with getting, all right? First of all, we have spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation. That is the belief that life generated spontaneously, okay, out of nothing, from non-living chemicals, by natural laws, with any intelligent intervention. All right, this is the belief that just out of nowhere, there were some chemicals really in a puddle, and that life came out from that by just natural law, okay? That there was nothing intervening into that. Here's one that we've heard, DNA. DNA is the chemical that encodes instructions for building and replicating all living things. All right, so anything that is alive has DNA, all right? And because it has DNA, that is the chemical that encodes instructions for building and replicating. All right, replication of cells cannot take place without DNA. We have specific complexity. You may hear this as specified complexity as well. This is an observable characteristic in living and non-living things that indicates design. When we look at it and we see the complexity, it's something that not only has complexity, in other words, it's not just complicated, but there's a message involved. For example, a group of random letters is complex. And I just take a group of random letters and throw them out there. There's complexity to that, right? We understand when I put, an alphabet down that it means that it's a language, right? If I were to show you some languages, you wouldn't necessarily even recognize it as a language because we've never seen it before, right? But a group of letters can be complex. However, a sentence, such as take out the garbage, right, is complex and it's specified. And it's positive evidence, this specific complexity is positive evidence for an intelligent being. Does that make sense? So in other words, if you were to walk into your kitchen and see on the fridge and the magnets on the fridge, take out the garbage, you would not assume that happened by accident. You would assume that your mother was in the kitchen, take out the garbage on the fridge, and that is the reason why, and she's trying to convey that message to you, okay? It wasn't an accident. So it's indication of intelligence. We have the principle of uniformity. Principle of uniformity. This is a scientific principle which states that causes in the past were like those in the present. Okay? Oops, I just hit the button, so it's going to go on. I'm not done talking about the first one yet. All right, so the principle of uniformity says that basically we can look back and assume that since something was like some way 1,000 years ago, it's still that way. All right? Now, we're going to talk about miracles, I think, in 2 weeks. I think it's 2 weeks, okay? Now, we're going to get to that. There's principles in Scripture that talk about how this is not always true, right? Like the flood, right? We don't experience worldwide floods regularly, right? So the principle of uniformity is not always true. But as a general principle in life, we can assume that if yesterday I held a tennis ball up and let it go, the principle of uniformity says that if I hold a tennis ball up today and let it go, it's going to do the same thing, right? It's going to fall, right? That's what the principle of uniformity states. Next is naturalism, which is a philosophical idea that all phenomena can be explained in terms of natural causes and laws, and thus excludes the possibility of the supernatural or spiritual. So if naturalism states that anything that we see should be able to be explained by natural law, and there is no such thing as the supernatural, okay? Or spiritual. If we can't see it, it doesn't exist. All right, we're going to get into some of these things as we go. Next is materialism. This is also a philosophical theory that states that only physical things exist, and that everything, and this is hard for us to kind of grasp if you don't think this is true, that everything, thoughts, feelings, the mind, will, everything can be explained in terms of matter and physical phenomena. Okay, so this would say that everything that we experience is basic chemical reactions. Okay, this is kind of what we would hear nowadays. Maybe you might hear that on, like, you know, and we hear about this, you know, he's a product of his DNA, right? Or he had, you know, we would say they talk about homosexuality a lot as like that's genetic. It's just who you are, all right? That is based out of this idea of materialism, that there is no will. There's no decision. You're just a product of your DNA. You're a product of the chemical reactions in your brain, and that's how you act. In other words, we're predetermined, which ultimately means, we're going to talk about this a lot next week, but it ultimately means that I really can't fault anyone for anything. We're only in this room because that's what our chemicals in our brains told us to do, right? It's all predetermined. And that we obviously do not agree with materialism. And then next is natural selection. This is a scientific theory which states that the individuals or groups best suited to their environment will survive. Natural selection. Okay, and then lastly, intelligent design is a scientific theory that says that some features of the universe and life exhibit features that are positive evidence of having been designed. Now, we talked about this last week. We talked about it the week before. We're going to finish it up this week. This does not assume the existence of a Christian God, just an existence of an intelligent being that designed the universe. This is not like, oh, well, this must be Jesus. You know, like, no, this isn't Jesus. This is just someone. This assuming intelligent design means that technically any theistic position could be correct. We're going to talk about Christianity as we go through the series, but this is not specific to Christianity. There are theists that would believe in intelligent design who are not Christian, okay? So, but this is just intelligent design, all right? The scientific theory that states that some features of the universe and life exhibit features that are positive evidence of having been designed, all right? So, that's all. All right, we got them out of our system, all right? So really there's two possibilities for the origins of life. The fact that the creation versus evolution debate is not so much a debate over evidence as it is over philosophy. And we've been covering this over the last couple of weeks. Some of this, maybe you're like, well, this is review. It's because the same principles apply to the cosmos as does to life and, you know, the microbiology as well. Everyone is looking at the same evidence. We have to remember that. It's not that we as theists are looking at a specific set of evidence and scientists are looking at a different set of evidence. We're all looking at the same evidence. We're coming to different conclusions. And the reason that we're coming to different conclusions is not because of the evidence that's provided, it's because of the philosophy that we have. As we talked about in lesson 1, the box top that we kind of fit all of our puzzle pieces into. that picture overall that we kind of say, okay, these are the puzzle pieces of life, this is the picture they go into. That's the predetermined decision. I can look at something, and a piece of evidence, and I say, oh, well, that's obviously evidence for design, but someone who's a naturalist or a materialist is going to look at it and say, oh, well, it must be a product of naturalist thinking or materialism, all right? So the debate really comes down to two major philosophical issues. What causes will we consider possible before we look at the evidence, all right? In other words, if I walk into evidence and I assume that there could be no supernatural option, then I'm never going to come to a supernatural conclusion. It's just like on a crime scene. If you were to walk into a crime scene and assume that it was a white male and it wasn't a white male, well, you're never going to come to the conclusion that it was who it was, an Asian guy or a woman. You're never going to come to those conclusions. It doesn't matter what the other option is if you assume before you walk in that it was a white male. And if we're not careful, we look at scientists that assume before they look at evidence that it was a naturalist viewpoint, right? It was something that this happened by material observation, by material processes. And since we see that, we can be drawn astray. It can be confusing. And so, if you think about it, a person who is a supernaturalist, a theist, right? That is us, right? Any natural option or supernatural option is an option, right? It's possible. Either is an option. Whereas someone who believes in naturalism really actually has they call us closed-minded, but it actually has a narrower view to only assume that natural things can happen. It's actually a narrower view than saying that both natural or supernatural things can happen, right? And so it's actually more narrow to be a naturalist. And so we kind of have this chart here in your notes here between naturalism and intelligent design. Between naturalism and intelligent design. So we're going to kind of go, what I'm going to do is we're going to just go straight across, right? Boom, 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 right? So naturalist, intelligent design, kind of the opposing theories, the opposing kind of thought processes here. All right, so first of all, naturalism believes only natural causes are possible. Whereas intelligent design believes that both natural and intelligent causes are possible, right? Either one's an option. I'm not saying that natural laws don't exist. We believe in gravity, right? We believe in the electromagnetic force, right? We believe these things. Those are natural causes. But not everything has to be those things. There can be things that occur that are outside of those things, namely the creation of the universe and the creation of life, right? Are the two ones that we've been looking at. Next, the first life arose spontaneously by chance from non-living chemicals. This is what a naturalist teaches. Intelligent design says even the simplest life has characteristics that are products of intelligence and cannot be explained by natural causes. Even the simplest life. I mean, there's not enough time tonight to go into how complex life is, like the simplest life. But even the simplest life has characteristics that are products of intelligence. All right, we're going to get into some of those, but there's not enough time to really delve into it. Come on, computer. There it is. All right. Naturalism teaches that adding long periods of time increases the chances for spontaneous generation. If we add long periods of time, then we're going to add the opportunity for spontaneous generation, this idea that life appears out of nothing. We're going to give it an opportunity to happen. That's convenient. It's very convenient, actually. It's very convenient. And we talked about that. I think there was a question about that last week where it's like effectively the naturalist uses time as their god of the gaps. They don't understand something? Well, it must have been time. Time happened, and over time, these things can happen. And they blame us for faith, having too much faith and an unreasonable faith. But intelligent design says no amount of time is enough to allow for spontaneous generation to occur. There's just no amount of time for that. There's no amount of time that you can say that is going to take place where spontaneous generation can happen. At some point, it just doesn't work out. The creation versus evolution debate, this is what a naturalist says. The creation versus evolution debate is about science versus faith, or faith, religion versus science. Religion versus science, but faith also works. Science versus faith, religion versus science, faith versus science. They've set up this false dichotomy that either science is true or faith, when God created science. So that's not an issue. So what we see is the creation versus evolution debate is really about good science versus bad science, right? It's taking everything and being open-minded and looking at what the evidence is pointing to. That's good science. And bad science is saying, oh no, well, we're going to just exclude options that this could be because we don't like where they may point. Although spontaneous generation isn't supported by empirical observation. In other words, we don't see spontaneous generation happen. Matter of fact, ironically, scientists try to make life in a petri dish. They try, and they can't do it. And even if they did do it, what would that prove? That it takes intelligence to make life, right? Even our intelligence can't make life. So why would we think that by accident it would happen? And so based on the principle of uniformity, because we don't see spontaneous generation happening at any point in the past, we have to assume then that the intelligent design is the best explanation for the origin of life. Assuming, because we don't see it, it only makes logical sense that that it's intelligence that answers it. So we have DNA. Oop, back. Here we go. My computer is spazzing out on me a little bit. All right, here we go. So DNA and specified complexity. And there are more things. Let me just note, normally I try to be really good about like putting things on screen and giving you the things to write. There's actually more slides than I could fit on like 2 pages. Okay, so there is some stuff that's cut out. So I left spaces. Like, look at how much space is on this page. Like, just right in the margins. All right. If there's something that hits you, that you're like, man, this is genius. I doubt that will happen, but if it does. So genetics is the study of how living organisms inherit traits from their ancestors. So that's the study. That's the scientific field. Genetic information is passed down through generations by DNA. My DNA is the DNA that my mother gave to me. I actually read recently, I think it was yesterday. It was very interesting. They said that mitochondrial DNA is only passed down through the woman. And therefore, by that logic, we all come from one woman, which we totally agree with. Anyway, it's so fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. DNA is made up a simple sequence of units. It's made up by 4 letters, all right, that represent chemicals. ATCG, all right? ATCG, I believe it's adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, if I remember correctly from biology class, all right? And the specific order of these units spell out the instructions. So in other words, these chemicals are there. When they're in their DNA, you know, on that helix, right? And in that order, then they spell out the instructions. The cell reads those instructions in DNA, and it does what it's supposed to do. And fingers become fingers, right? And a heart becomes a heart, right? And it's pretty amazing stuff. It's pretty amazing stuff. It's not good if your hand decided to be a heart. That wouldn't work well, right? And we see these things, they happen, and they're bad, all right? Pretty much uniformly. So just like I said, we talked about those magnets on the fridge, you can almost like that same thing, where except instead of 26 letters in the alphabet, there's 4, right? And combinations of those 4 pieces of that A, T, C, G, along where they are on the right chromosome and all that stuff, dictates everything that is about us, everything that's about your dog, everything that is about the smallest cell is contained in this DNA. Just like reading a book requires you to know the particular sequence of letters, right? If I have 26 letters, they don't help me if I can't read what those letters are, all right? If I don't know, I can even recognize them as a language, but if they're not in any sort of logical order, then that doesn't help us. But our bodies read this DNA and determine the traits and decode that into our genetic instructions. It's an amazing thing. The sequence of this 4-letter alphabet on DNA combined with the living cell determines the unique genetic makeup of that cell and the organism as a whole. The DNA of just the cell nucleus of one tiny amoeba contains more information than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Just the smallest one single-celled amoeba, just the DNA of the cell nucleus, okay? If you were to spell out all the units, A, T, C, G, of the entire amoeba, the letters would fill 1,000 sets of encyclopedias. That's on a single cell. That doesn't count you and me, all right, where there's trillions of cells. So the amount Pastor and I was actually recently having this discussion about, have you that 23andMe, and, they look at your thing, they look at your DNA, and, how safe is that someone takes your, DNA and they put it on file somewhere, But I was reading about it because I was, I was like, I don't know what I agree. Do I like this? I don't like the government, knowing anything about me. I don't want it to have my phone number, never mind my DNA sequence. So I started reading about it, and the amount of information that they look at is like looking at one page of information. If the amount of information in your DNA code would be like the Library of Congress. It's amazing to think. And they can still tell with some accuracy where you're from and stuff. If you have pre-existing conditions in your life. I mean, it's insane to think how much information is in our bodies, and we can determine information about us from even the smallest amounts of DNA. If you were to walk on the beach, you're walking down, Vero Beach, South Beach here, and you see "I love you" scrawled in the sand, we would not go, man, what an amazing thing that as the waves hit the sand, as the crabs crawled across it, as the clams bubbled up, that it made this message all by completely natural causes. We would walk by it and assume that someone wrote "I love you" in the sand. Well, of course we would. It's absurd to think otherwise. And that is because, it's not because we lack a natural explanation for the message. It's because we've experienced positive evidence that there's intelligence behind this message. Messages do not happen by accident. That's not the way it is. We don't believe that if you blow up the Library of Congress, you're going to get thousands of sets of encyclopedias, right? That's not the way that works. Order, we talked about this before, comes to disorder, right? We don't ever have disorder creating order. And intelligence and organization, like the human body, is an orderly thing. If you've ever talked to anybody who's experienced illness, talk to doctors, go to a cancer, ward. Cancer is just the body being out of order. It's the cells of your body trying to do things they're not supposed to do. That's what cancer is. We say that's a bad thing because it's a bad thing, right? When we see in our lives disorder, we don't see order. Since no human has observed the origin of the first life, how can we know how the first life came into being then? We weren't there, we didn't see it. But this is a forensic question, all right? This is not an observable. We weren't there. We have to use the principle of uniformity. We have to use the scientific method and go back. Humans didn't observe the origin of the Grand Canyon. But based on studies in geology, we can assume that the Grand Canyon was caused by natural forces, right? Natural forces, a lot of water, all right? Now, there's disagreements on what water that was, whether we believe that it was the flood. Others would believe it's a river. But either way, it was water, and it was a lot of it, and that is a natural force. Water is a natural force. But we do not walk by Mount Rushmore and assume that water caused that. Why? Because it's ridiculous to think so. There are natural forces that we can observe that take place in our universe, and there are intelligent forces that take place in the world around us that we see. Intelligence is the only viable explanation for something that contains specific complexity, like Mount Rushmore. So what causes the first life? Well, when we find this so-called simple life forms containing such specified complexity, the principle of uniformity should lead us to conclude that intelligence is the cause. It's just the logical outcome. So what about spontaneous generation? Now, there's a lot of information on this kind of topic out there. There's books, the internet. Some may argue that we haven't found a natural explanation for the existence of life doesn't mean that we won't find it in the future. All right, that's an argument, right? Just because we haven't found it yet doesn't mean that we won't find it in the future. And there's validity to that. This is possible. This is possible. I mean, just from a logical perspective, right? Again, we have to step outside what we believe, right, and take this from logic, right? This is logical, right? We didn't know that the world revolved around the sun. Now we do, right? Like, things change. Science finds things out, and that's okay. There are 4 known natural forces: gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, and they're repetitive forces. In other words, they act the same way all the time. They do the same thing, up and down, gravity, right, electromagnetism, positive and negative, the strong and weak nuclear forces. These exist, and they just are there, and they are repetitive. This means that it is possible that we would find a natural source, but it's super unlikely. The 4 forces that we know don't create life, so we would literally have to find like a whole new force, right, which is a big deal, okay? It's a big deal if this were to happen. The second law of thermodynamics also weighs against order rising from disorder. So if anything, life is ordered, okay? So there's some ideas that people have come up with that, they try to explain these things. The first one is called panspermia. Panspermia. The evidence is so strong for an intelligent cause, really, as opposed to naturalism, that some evolutionists have gone so far as to suggest that aliens, okay, and I'm not saying this like to mock, but this is a serious thing, okay, that aliens or some other intelligent life came by and planted panspermia, is called seeds everywhere. That's what that means, I think Latin. Panspermia, seeds everywhere. And they deposited the first life on Earth. All right, there's like movies about this, right, like Stargate, right? We're science fiction nerds. All right, anyways. Fred Hoyle, who we have quoted in the past, actually is the one that came up with this idea of panspermia, after calculating the probability of life arising by itself as almost 0. And he was like, okay, so if it's almost 0, but we know for sure that life on Earth wasn't by God, so therefore it must be aliens. It must be that someone came by, they started life on Earth, because we don't see that it happens. The problem is that, as we talked about before, God does not require a beginning. But intelligent aliens, they do require a beginning. So even if that is true, who made the aliens, right? Where did they come from? If natural forces can't create life on Earth, then why would we expect natural forces to create intelligent aliens somewhere else? It's not about faith versus reason. You see how when you start to just exclude possibilities of supernatural intervention, all of a sudden you become very unreasonable in where you're really stretching out to get answers for these things, when the simplest answer is that there is an intelligent being that created the world. It's about reasonable faith versus unreasonable faith, because it still takes faith to believe that unintelligent aliens came by Earth and planted seeds here. But there's another belief called reductionism. Reductionism is the false belief that you can reduce life and everything in it to its non-living components. If I were to take Brother Steve, break him down, he's so much carbon, so much oxygen, so much water, right? He's all these different components. The problem with this belief is that DNA proves that life is more than a conglomeration of chemicals, right? There's 4 chemicals. But if I were to read the DNA sequence of my son, I would not read that DNA sequence and go, yep, that's Daniel. It's clear from A, T, C, G, right there. It's obvious that's Daniel. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And because of that, even if you were just to reduce it to those chemicals, life contains a message. Life itself contains a message that is in the DNA, but it is not, the chemicals are not what caused that message. There has to be intelligence to interpret the DNA into life. A reductionist would say that everything about a book can be reduced to ink and paper. But that doesn't make any sense at all. Such an assertion is nonsense. The message in a book, like the message of DNA, points to intelligence beyond mere chemicals. You have a handout today, and yes, you can reduce this to ink and paper, or toner and paper in our case. You can reduce it to that, but that does not give us the message of the notes. It doesn't give us the complexity that is the message, that is the notes that are there. Well, information can be expressed through chemicals. The source of that information must exist outside of those chemicals, all right? And so there is intelligence. And so this is one of my favorite quotes in our book. Let's see if it'll go. Let's try again. Come on, computer. There it is. God never performed a miracle to convince an atheist because his ordinary works provide sufficient evidence. Isn't that so true? There's no amount of evidence that can convince somebody that doesn't want to learn, that doesn't want to know. And so therefore, God's regular acts are enough to convince us if you just look. And we talked about that in the past as well. So, oops, jump back. Here we go. My computer's freaking out a little bit. But we're working on it. All right, microevolution versus macroevolution. All right, we have another sweet table. So we have this idea then of microevolution and macroevolution. These two terms, basically microevolution, evolution, because here's the thing. Evolution is not wrong. Like, it happens. We evolve. You're like, what? I'm leaving. Everyone gets up and goes. No, evolution is right. There's no problem. We don't have a problem with evolution. You know that the ability to drink milk is a genetic defect. We're not supposed to drink milk, humans. At the age of 12, your body is supposed to stop creating the chemical that allows you to digest milk. That's normal. But what happened was, primarily in Europe, is that because of shortness of day and because of lack of sunlight, people who didn't create that enzyme died because you didn't get enough vitamin D. But people that could drink milk and didn't get sick from it, right? Those people, they lived because you need vitamin D to live, right? And because you need vitamin D to live, you can drink milk. That gives you vitamin D. You survive. The people who didn't drink milk didn't have enough vitamin D and died because there's not enough sun. This is why white European-based people are lactose tolerant, but there's a vast number of African-descended people, most like 90%, are lactose intolerant. They're actually normal, and we're the freaks that can drink milk. We're the genetic mutations. That is an example of microevolution. Little bits of changes that cause people to survive. And that's okay. We believe in that. We would agree with that. That's in the Bible. There's no problem with that at all. There's no problem with that at all. My son has a condition. It's called thalassemia. And he has a condition. I probably have it too. I've never been tested because, I don't know, I'm one of those people that's like, I don't care. You know, whatever. But it's a genetic condition that basically causes his hemoglobin to be misshapen. And it doesn't, because his hemoglobin is misshapen, it does not carry oxygen properly. The thing is I am of Italian descent. My great-grandmother was from Italy. And so I'm from Italian descent. Thalassemia is very common in that region. The reason it's very common in that region is because malaria is very common in that region. And people who have thalassemia, or thalassemia beta, which is what my son has, don't catch malaria because malaria attaches on to this part of the hemoglobin and it goes around your body, and that's how you get sick. But people who have this disease are naturally more resistant to malaria. And so in that select region, people who didn't have this condition, this genetic condition, died from malaria. The people who did have this genetic condition lived. And so they passed that same condition onto their children, and now people of Mediterranean descent are more likely to have that disease, that condition. And we found it in my son. And I have similar symptoms to what he had, and my mother had similar symptoms, and my grandmother had similar symptoms. So chances are, though none of us have been tested, we all have the same thing, right? It's a genetic issue. And that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. That is microevolution. Macroevolution is the idea that major changes happen in species that causes other species, all right? In other words, eventually a major change to the wings of a bird cause it to become legs, right? Major changes, okay? And we're going to talk about why that's an issue in a minute, but this is this idea of microevolution versus macroevolution. If someone says to you, do you believe in evolution, don't ever say yes or no. Ask them what kind of evolution. right? Don't ever say yes or no. Most of the time it's a trap anyway, but right? So you want them to clarify anyway. But don't ever say yes or no right away. Say, well, what kind of evolution? Because yeah, I believe in evolution. Little changes happen in humanity, and that's not a big deal. We don't have a problem with that. So what do we have here? So we have this idea of Darwinism versus intelligent design. Darwinism versus intelligent design. Darwinism says that new life forms evolved by natural selection. Intelligent design says new life forms have never been observed to arise from other life forms. We've never seen that happen. And so therefore, life has only been observed to come from the same type of existing life. In other words, dogs always have dogs. They might be different dogs. They might be malformed dogs. They might be poodle and a Great Dane, but they're both very clearly dogs. A dog never comes out to have a cat, right? That never happens. Okay, dogs don't come, horses don't come from dogs, right? Dogs are dogs, cats are cats, horses are horses, humans are humans. Darwinism says, again, new life forms evolved by natural selection. Intelligent design says irreducible complexity seems to preclude new life forms from arising by slight successive changes. In other words, if the first thing that evolves without a properly functioning kidney, it dies, right? Even if it has a perfectly functioning heart, it has a perfectly functioning liver, if it has a perfectly functioning pancreas, if it doesn't have perfectly functioning kidneys, it dies. So when it dies and the next one comes up, if that one has perfectly functioning kidneys, but it doesn't have a perfectly functioning liver, it also dies. In other words, if you were to take any part of us and remove it from the equation, then we die. We're irreducibly complex. We're irreducibly complex. You can't just remove pieces of an organism and assume that it will still continue to live. Irreducible complexity says new life forms can't arise from slight successive changes. There should be some form, we should be able to find, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, some sort of fossil record that says that there's like a bird with a half a wing. The problem is if a bird had a half a wing, it wouldn't be able to fly, therefore wouldn't be able to run away from a predator, and therefore at best would die from being eaten. At worst, wouldn't be able to catch food, and therefore would die of starvation. But either way, it's dead and doesn't make new birds, which means that there's no intermediate steps. Darwinism says the origin of new life forms via evolution is proven by the evolutionary fossil record. But fossils remains are inadequate to establish ancestral relationships. We can't look back at the fossil record. And again, I just don't have time to go into this in depth, but you just can't do it. It doesn't go back that way. There's too many gaps. There's too many gaps. Darwinism says only natural causes are considered possible. But natural and intelligent causes are considered possible, right? Both are options. It's feasible that God started life. Even if evolution is true, which I think the belief in macroevolution is false by evidence. We can look at evidence and say this doesn't happen, but even if it was true, the Cambrian explosion, which is in the one above you, the Cambrian explosion is more consistent with an immediate creation rather than evolution. In other words, if the Cambrian explosion did happen, all of a sudden scientists say the Cambrian explosion is this explosion of life onto the scene. Yeah, we believe in an explosion of life on the scene, right? Happened in, day 5, right? We believe in that. That's a reasonable assumption, the Cambrian explosion, but that's more consistent with creation than it is with evolution. We should be seeing things before this explosion of life. If, like, pre-life, right? It doesn't make any sense. And then lastly here, observable micro changes can be extrapolated to prove that unobservable macro evolution occurred. They backwards think this. We see small things like I talked about with thalassemia, like I talked about with milk, right? Those small changes, they go backwards and say, see, these small mutations, which in both of my examples were negative, by the way. They're both mutations. They prove macroevolution. I heard the illustration like this. It'd be like if you guys would go out and buy a house, and your wife walks into the house one day, and she looks in the living room, and she's like, man, this house is great, but you know what would be greater? if the living room and the dining room were one big room and we knocked this wall down. And everyone's like, yes, I've experienced this, okay? Right? This would be greater if we just didn't have this wall here and we had one big room. And so you, being a loving, giving husband, knock the wall down for your wife and finish it. And someone walks into your house after the project's done. And they go, what a beautiful house. And you say, yep, I built the whole thing by knocking down walls. Doesn't make any sense. Knocking down walls does not build a house. Negative mutations do not create life, right? They're actually opposites, all right? They're actually opposites. And so while microevolution has been observed, it cannot be used for evidence for macroevolution, which has never been observed. It can't be used for evidence for macroevolution because we've never seen that happen. We've never seen that happen. So what are some we're going to go through these really quickly, 5 inadequacies of natural selection. 5 inadequacies of natural selection. So of natural selection, this idea, the survival of the fittest is how we hear it, nowadays. Natural selection, that through natural means, things are going to survive, and then those things that survive are going to have more, right? And eventually we get, flight and gills and, humanity. So we have these 5 things, and there is more, but here's 5. First, genetic limits. There are limits to genetic change that appear to be built into biological creatures. Like I said before, dogs always make dogs. Genetic limits allow each kind, right, which is what the Bible says, everything after its kind, okay? Each kind to make another of that kind. But it calls into question the plausibility of macroevolution, that one living thing would create a completely different living thing. A fish would create a lizard, right? Fish make fish. They do a great job. Fish make fish wonderfully. Lizards make lizards wonderfully. Fish don't ever make lizards. It's not the way that we don't see that. And there's genetic limits to that. There's an amount of stretch. Anyone that does dog breeding will understand this. There's a stretch that you can cause the genetics to stretch, but at a certain point, it doesn't work anymore, right? You have horses, you have donkeys, and you have mules, right? There's genetic stretching there, but a mule can't have offspring, right? It's done. It can't keep stretching. You can't keep stretching the DNA. It only works for so long. Then you have cyclical change. Cyclical change. Genetics changes within a species are not directional towards the development of new life forms. We talked about this already, but simply shift back and forth within a limited range. This is what Darwin saw, right? He saw birds with different shaped beaks, right? We've all heard the story from science class, right? But the thing is that those beaks, they actually cycled. In other words, if you go there in the winter, certain birds are alive that have one type of beak, and you go there at a different season or after a different amount of rain, and the other birds it's gone back, right? So if you go through a drought, you might see certain animals thrive, ones that have genetic markers that are going to help them survive in a drought. But once the rain comes back, the animals are going to shift back towards normalcy, and that genetic mutation is going to be a minimal. This is what we mean by cyclical change. They shift back and forth within that limited range. They don't keep going, all right? Next. Irreducible complexity. We talked about this already, so we'll go quickly. I'll just read it. A scientific idea that states many of the systems we observe in biological entities are composed of multiple interacting parts, where the removal of any part will cause the system to cease to malfunction. The classic case of this is the mousetrap. The guy who came up with this took a mousetrap and said, if you take away any piece of this mousetrap, the whole mousetrap doesn't work. And the evolutionist he was arguing with said, of course, that's completely untrue. And this is, you'll hear, no, that was proven false. Irreducible complexity was proven false. The guy who came up with it was proven false by the evolutionist that he was arguing. The problem is that the evolutionist that he was arguing didn't take out parts of the existing mousetrap. He made a new mousetrap. The mousetrap that didn't use those same pieces. That's like saying, oh, well, if I take the engine out of my car, the car won't run. It's irreducibly complex. And the guy says, oh, well, I can make a car that doesn't use an engine. Like, okay, but you have to design the car around not using an engine, right? The whole design changes. It doesn't just, you don't just take the existing thing and pull it out, right? And that's the concept here. All right, this precludes the system from being built gradually, all right? It precludes it from being, again, if I don't have kidneys, I die. Non-viability of transitional forms. Lots of big words today. Non-viability of transitional forms. This is the idea that even if Darwinian transitional forms existed, they wouldn't be able to survive long enough to reproduce healthy offspring. Think about the way evolution thinks. You get a bird. It's finally the first full-fledged functioning bird. I don't know about you, but my understanding of the way life is made means that one bird is not enough. You actually need two birds, right? They have to be two birds. They have to be in the same region, right? My soulmate, I believe I found my soulmate, okay, but this is just for example. My soulmate, if my soulmate exists in South Africa, that doesn't help me, right? I can't find her, she's not there, right? It has to be local, right? So bird one that wants to reproduce with bird two to make said offspring that is a third functioning bird, right, has to find another bird in its same lifetime of the opposite gender in the same region, right? This can't happen 40 years apart from each other even, which if you think about it, the evolutionist believes there's 14 billion years to life. 40 years is not a big subsection of that. It's a pretty rare occurrence that evolutionary thing would happen together, all right? So there's a non-viability of transitional forms. It just doesn't, there's a lot that would have to be the exact perfect thing, and it would have to happen over and over and over again. Because it's not just birds. It's birds and fish and lizards and monkeys and dogs and cats and humans. And it would have to keep happening for every single species. Like, that's crazy unlikely, right? Crazy unlikely. And then, lastly here, molecular isolation, which is the scientific idea that the comparison of protein sequences, and I know this is like, maybe, if this doesn't make sense to you, throw it away. But the comparison of protein sequences in living organisms reveals distinct gaps between supposedly ancestral forms. In other words, our DNA, though it's like monkey's DNA, it's not that like it. It's not like it enough for us to be alive in the middle, okay? Because there's different sequences. So why can't Darwinism explain this dissimilarity? Darwinists say the similarities of living things, right? Humans are like monkeys. We're similar with respect to their homology, which is our body type, and the genetic code, is evidence of common ancestry and macroevolution. Although it could be evidence of common ancestry, it could be. That's not the only possibility. Instead of pointing to a common ancestor by unguided macroevolution, this evidence could also point to a common special creation, a common designer in special creation. The similarities between us and monkeys could be that we were made by the same people. If my son builds something, we talked about this last week, builds something out of Legos, two of his creations are similar. That doesn't prove that that they're related. All it proves is that they had the same builder. And it's very possible, and we see this in architecture, we see this all over our world, right? Fords look similar, right? BMWs look similar, right? And you would say, well, this BMW is clearly made by the same person. Yeah, it's made by the same person. That's the whole thing. We don't assume that it evolved that way, right? It was made by intelligence. Remember that scientists don't say anything, but scientists do. Science doesn't say anything, scientists do, right? Science is an observation. Scientists are the ones that interpret, all right? That science is just a thing that exists. Scientists are the ones that take the science and say things about it. And many scientists carry their philosophical presuppositions that allow them to rule out intelligent design. There are many things that cast doubt on natural selection, but ultimately it's not the similarities. It's not us being similar to monkeys that needs to be explained, but rather the vast dissimilarities. Don't let someone say, well, since monkeys and humans are similar, therefore we're the same. Let's talk about all the differences between monkeys and humans, because there's a lot of dissimilarities. Namely, like, humans can do math, monkeys can't. We speak in multiple languages, monkeys can't. We build buildings, monkeys can't. All right? There's vast dissimilarities, and I think that personally, once you hit intelligence, once you hit the idea of intelligence, there is nothing close to humanity, right? And so therefore, that is a vast dissimilarity. So yes, it's true that humans bear resemblance to apes, but so what? Why does that even matter? We also are supposedly bear ancestry with snakes, with trees, right? If we all came from one amoeba, we share common ancestry with every living thing on this planet, if evolution is true. Which means, why don't we look like snakes? Right? Why don't we look like horses? Right? Doesn't make any sense. Like, just because there's similarities in certain areas, that doesn't explain the similarities that we don't have with other things that are supposedly our ancestors. Right? So it just doesn't follow. So we certainly don't look like snakes or trees, but the Darwinist claims that we share common ancestors with them. Their response is inherently circular. A Darwinist's evolutionist response is inherently circular. We know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by the way of unguided macroevolutionary processes because of DNA and body type. How do we know that DNA and body type all point to a common ancestor? Well, because evolution's true, right? So evolution's true because we look the same, and we look the same because evolution's true. That's inherently circular, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't follow. It's not logical. So is there lack of evidence for macroevolution? If there is a lack of evidence for macroevolution, then what is the truth? Atheist Richard Dawkins, who's very popular right now, he admits that if gradualism is not true, then we're forced to accept a miraculous explanation. If it's not true, then it must have been miraculous. This would imply the existence of God, which, as we see in the next section, next week, is the main reasons atheists continue to say that Darwinism is true. If natural forces didn't cause new life forms and intelligence did, it's the only alternative. It's two options. Either it happened naturally or it didn't. So, come on, wake up. It doesn't want to. There we go. So why do they still believe in evolution? I don't think this is still there. So why does Darwinists still believe in evolution? Darwinists don't want to admit that they're not the highest authority about what's true and what's not. That's why. They say, hey, we're scientists. And so we're the arbiters of truth. Darwinists don't want to admit that they don't have absolute authority about what causes everything. Again, it's this idea that they're above other people. And I can respect a scientist who's gone to school and learned stuff. Like I don't have a problem with that. But just because you've gone to school doesn't mean that you are the gate of truth. Darwinists don't want to risk losing their academic and financial statuses. If you come out and you say that you are for intelligent design, all of a sudden people don't want to give you money anymore. All right? And Darwinists don't want to admit that they don't have the authority to determine what's right and what's wrong. And we're going to talk about morality next week. But if everything is based on just chemicals, we're in a whole different world. It's a whole different ballgame than if there's a moral truth. So ultimately, the fact is that Darwinism is morally comfortable, allowing people to remain free from perceived restraints of Christianity and theism. If God doesn't exist, there's no higher power for Darwinists to be accountable or to submit their will to. And then lastly here, so asking the right questions. So you say, okay, all right, I got it. Maybe there's stuff I didn't get, because there's stuff I didn't get, even though I just taught it. All right, I don't really grasp. What does this matter? So, asking the right questions. So let's say someone comes up to you and says that I believe in evolution. When someone makes a truth claim, evolution is true, it is their job to prove it. Okay? Let's remember that. As we go out and we talk to people, right? They say, oh, I believe that God doesn't exist. They say, it's your job to prove that God exists. You're making the truth claim. But inherently, by saying that we believe that you don't believe God exists, that means you believe that evolution is true. So they're making a truth claim too. Okay? They're making a truth claim too. If it's their job, if they make the truth claim, it's their job to refute it. So when they say I believe in evolution, let's ask them 3 questions. This is the takeaway. This is the takeaway for this week. What do you mean by that? These are not complex questions. What do you mean by that? Let's get clarification about what the person means and how he's defining terms. Okay? I believe in evolution. What do you mean by that? This is actually good for any question. Okay? Anytime someone makes a truth claim, first thing, what do you mean by that? Someone says, I don't believe God exists. Really? What do you mean by that? Right? One, you're not making any assumptions and you're not defending yourself. You're putting it back on them, which is a great defensive place to be, especially if you're not really ready to answer the question. Right? What do you mean by that? Right? It gives you some time to think. Someone says, I don't believe that Jesus really resurrected. I don't believe that the Bible is true. I don't believe whatever. Really? What do you mean by that? Can you expound on that further? Why don't you mean that, right? Next, that's the next. Why? How did you come to this conclusion, right? Someone says, I don't believe in the resurrection. Really? How do you come to that conclusion? Oh, well, I don't think the New Testament's reliable. Really? How did you come to that conclusion? Well, it was, doctored by people, by the church over thousands of years, right? Really? You think it's reasonable that when the church changed what the Bible said, they went through every single copy in circulation over the whole existing world at that time and changed it? That seems unlikely, right? Because a lot of times people say stuff. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people, sometimes it's us, okay? Right? A lot of times people say stuff and they've never thought about it. And so these are questions that can kind of make people think about what they think, right? How did you come to that conclusion? This question encourages the person to support their claims with evidence as opposed to just saying something. I don't believe the New Testament is true. Like, well, that's easy to say. It's a lot harder to prove, right? It's easy to say. It's a lot harder to prove. Even the people who believe they can prove it as false, it's not something that they came about like by reading one book. It was something that they studied for years, and most people have not studied it for years, right? So a lot of times this is enough to make people just leave you alone, which is actually a positive in most cases. So making him think through evidence for his beliefs can help him see the holes in his own theory and his own beliefs, right? And that's what we're trying to do in our series. And then lastly, have you ever considered ... right? Use this, complete this sentence by offering evidence for design or creation. Well, have you ever considered irreducible complexity? That if life came to being, you can't have like transitional forms that don't have kidneys. That doesn't make sense. And everyone goes, well, no, well, you tell me about somebody who doesn't have a kidney before there was dialysis machines, right? This isn't today. This is supposedly hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? So this is where you follow it up. And this is where, too, you can direct your conversation into an area that you know about, which is convenient. Have you ever, someone says, I believe in evolution. Maybe you say, I don't understand all this, but I really like the cosmology side, right? Sister Neva always likes the math side, right? Have you ever considered the existence that truth exists, right? 2 + 2 is 4. That's what it is, right? So you can kind of steer the conversation. If you're interested, I've brought this book in before. If you're interested kind of more in this idea, this conceptual, like, what questions to ask along these types of lines, the book Tactics by Greg Koukl, I mentioned it a couple weeks ago, he goes in depth into this idea of asking questions to come about and like direct your conversation, as opposed to, like I said, a lot of times when we're asked questions like this, we're very much taken aback, right? Like, oh, I was not ready for this at all. I was not ready on my lunch break to discuss, why there's evil in the world. Like, I'm not ready for this. I have to use the bathroom. That's the kind of our response a lot of times. And sometimes just asking questions and getting to where they're coming from can help direct the conversation. One, you actually know what they're saying, which is a positive, because a lot of times as Christians, we kind of get into our spiel, right? Like someone asks us a question and we're like, I don't care what you think. Let me tell you what Jesus did for you, This way, it's more calm. It's more, a lot of times when you're asking, and Jesus did this, asking questions about people, right? And about what they are thinking, it's a much more, it's less abrasive, right? And that can help us to lead the conversation. And a lot of times, we get to the end of these types of conversations where we ask these questions, we haven't given the gospel, right? We've just talked. And then, thank God, lunch break is over, and we can go back and we can follow up later, right? We can take a breath and do some reading and do some learning, all right? So I know that was a lot of information. I put a thing on the bottom here of an article. I was going to print the article, and then I found out that it was 22 pages, so I didn't print it. But if you get a chance, it's a very good article by Jonathan Wells. There was a book that was written that was called Why Darwinism is True. And this man, Jonathan Wells, who is a biologist who believes in intelligent design, wrote a rebuttal article on this book called Why Darwinism is False. And you can find it at that link that I put in your thing. And it's a very good read. It goes through the book. It talks about common arguments and why they're not true, okay? But it's a read. I printed mine, so I could like mark where I ended so I could read it in multiple sittings, all right? And then if you're following along in our book, we're at going to be through page 193. It's chapter 7 on morality and the basis of morality. We're going to be there next week. All right, any questions?
I think the guy who wrote the book is also a non-Christian, which is even better.
Jonathan Wells, I don't think he is a Christian. I think he just believes in intelligent design, I believe. But that's okay. He still can have good stuff. Sure. It's okay. He can still be right on this. And so yes, I believe that's correct from what I read about him.
Just like Socrates wasn't.
Yes. Yeah. Lots of great philosophers weren't believers, but their insights about creation and things are still accurate. Brother Steve?
Yeah, God calls us a peculiar race, a peculiar people.
Yep.
And this is kind of off that line. Chris and I are both lactose intolerant, so we got German ancestry.
Yep.
And,
Yes.
well, we got maybe some African American.
It's possible. My wife is lactose intolerant as well. And my daughter is, but I'm not. But again, that's genes, right? My daughter is, me and my son are not. My son got the bad stuff from me, the disease, right? All right. Any other questions? Anything else? All right. If you have questions, again, you can always like text them to me if you think of something during the week, because I know you guys go home and ponder these deeply. No, I'm just kidding. I am super bad at this. Like, I'm going to admit to everyone, like, confession time. Like, I am super bad at asking questions. And I'm going to blame it on being a preacher, but I am super bad at this, and it is something that I'm working on. But I did not use these questions, but I did catch myself in a discussion with a coworker a few weeks ago, and I was trying to, like, move these questions in. And it is a muscle. Right? It's something we exercise. It's something that we practice to get better at. But what a wonderful thing if we could get to a point where, like, our first reaction, our initial response is like one of these things where we're inquiring instead of a lot of times deferring off of it. I find that I know myself, when someone brings a question up to me that I'm not really ready for, I kind of I'll like answer quick and then defer like to something that I'm more comfortable talking about because I'm not really ready for that question. But as believers, what a great place that it would be if we could, whenever one of these situations comes up, dive right in, right? And get into that and answer those real questions that people have. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And you can do this with politics, right? The same thing. You can do it with politics if you're of that persuasion to argue about politics, right? Someone brings up, whatever, Black Lives Matter or abortion or whatever, and they say, there's racial inequity in our country. Really? How did you come to that conclusion? And then let them offer evidence. And then when they offer evidence that you don't believe is correct, you can say, well, have you considered this? Have you considered that? And you can kind of guide that conversation. John? Mm-hmm.
It's almost like it's just very biased.
Yes. Well, and that's a phenomenal movie. God's Not Dead is a really good movie. If you get a chance, I think it's on Netflix or Amazon right now for free, because that's how I watch my movies. It's for free. But that's a phenomenal movie. And one of the things in that movie that they portray is that where the professor gets up and he just, berates the students into submission and uses his position of authority. And the thing is it's that same idea where he is making a truth claim. God doesn't exist. So it's up to him to prove it, really. And in that book, Tactics, he actually has a whole section on arguing in a classroom setting, like in a professor classroom. And he always says it's a foolish war tactic to fight from an entrenched position. In other words, the professor has all the power in that situation, and the student is in an entrenched position, and it's foolish for him to try and fight. There's no reason. Don't let him. And as a student, and if we're ever in a position where someone who, like a white coat syndrome, right, where there's someone who's like really intelligent and is arguing from a position of authority, it's wise for us to let them speak and let them, and if they, and you can question them, and if they say something, you say, hey, I acknowledge that you are smarter than me, and I'm just trying to learn what you believe. It's your job to teach me then. Teach me, and you can question them, and you can ask these types of questions, and if they try to write off and say, oh, you're just a Christian, you say, whoa, I never said I was a Christian. You're making that assumption. You're making a truth claim. It's your job to argue it. It's your job to defend it. It's not mine, right? I'm not supposed to argue. They want us to argue for creation and argue their evolutionary points as well. That's what most evolutionists want. They want us to argue both points because supposedly we're supposed to have all the answers. And we never said we had all the answers. That's not actually a thing. We don't say that. And so we can be careful. And these questions are good starters. Like I said, that book is phenomenal. And it will help. I think it really helped me to get to a point where I recognize, like, okay, when I'm going into one of these situations, I'm not super comfortable. I'm not super comfortable. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a stage situation where it's like very formal debate, where it's like personal and like I actually care about offending the person. I don't want to like argue with them. I want to have a discussion, and I'm not comfortable in that situation. I think most people aren't. And that helps you. It helps us to take kind of a very non-confrontational, non-abrasive approach that is inquisitive. And at the end, if you really get beat, right? You really get beat, and the guy is just, they know way more than you, then you can always say, man, you've given me a lot to think about. I'm going to go home and think about that. And you know what? At that point, if they keep trying to push at you, you say, I've already said I have to go home and think about this. Like, conversation over, right? Like, I'm done speaking about this. You've given me stuff to think about. Let me go. And you can kind of diffuse the situation and move on. So, Brother Steve?
Quickly, and it's something I learned when I was working, is when you're in a conversation, when you ask a question, don't stop and then add on. Just end the question.
Yes, yeah, and that's a thing, brevity and asking questions that are concise and actually asking a question where you lead, right? You're leading where they're going is a big thing, and that again takes practice and understanding. And maybe you'll have a discussion with a person and have kind of like an argument, or you go back and forth, and you'll I don't know, you've ever witnessed to someone and after you walked away, you realize, like, oh, I should have said this, and I should have said this, right? Oh, man, like, I should have said all these things. Well, if we're proactive as believers, which the scripture says we're supposed to, maybe we should go home and write those things down. Maybe replay that conversation and try and think through what they were going to say. And take a very thoughtful approach to our witnessing and to our discussions with people, and we'll get better at it, right? And that's what we want. We want to be more effective. If we're more effective at arguing what we believe, and arguing the truth of Scripture, then it will be, now, we're never going to convince a person who doesn't want to know, right? But we can do everything in our power to be convincing. And like Pastor said on Wednesday, we can go to places where people are seeking God. And when they are seeking God, God will bring those people into our lives, and then we can be effective, and God will bless that. And that's what we want. That's our desire. So, yes, sir.
I think too many of us Christians get too emotional, and then we become heated. And I don't know where we miss that, but that's Satan's realm. He plays on emotions.
Yeah.
So we have to remember that even if they're doing heinous acts and they're off thinking, they're still a non-believer.
Yes.
It's not their behavior that's causing them to be a non-believer. They haven't accepted Christ.
Yeah.
And we want to attack them on their beliefs, and it all comes back
And
down to compassion.
And a good principle, kind of rule of note, is if either of us gets angry, we've lost, right? If either of us gets angry, we've lost. There was a man, He wrote the book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, who's a Muslim man. And he talked about how when you walk up to an unsafe person and you give them the gospel, you are completely tearing down their entire worldview. That's abrupt. That is drastic, right? And yeah, and we should expect defensiveness from that. Now, here's the thing. When you get to know somebody, right? You get to know somebody, you become friends, you begin to love them, right, over the course of time. Now you're saying, I'm going to go up to you and I'm going to tear down your entire worldview. They at least can look at you and say, well, I know you're my friend, and you would not do this unless you really believed it's true, right? Where it's a whole different thing. If I walk up to a stranger and I just say, everything you believe about the world, God, religion is false, that is like, and of course, like shields go up. Like, whoa, 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 whoa. But once we get to know people, this is why like our coworkers and our neighbors and stuff, it's so important that we get to know them and we get to fellowship with them, and they get to know that we actually care about the people. And if we care about the people, then when we go up to them and we say, hey, look, man, this is not consistent in your worldview, and that worldview that they've held for maybe 30, 40, 50 years is beginning to crumble, and it hurts them. It hurts them. Then all of a sudden, it's like, they would not hurt me like this because I know they love me unless they knew it was what was good for me, right? It's just, I mean, this is how we deal with our children with stuff, right? And, you know, so not to say that that's always going to make them respond, but it's just a way that we can handle that. And so anyway, so that's the thing. And like in that instance with that man who wrote that book, his roommate in college, I think, dealt with him for 5 years, where they would just discuss Christianity and Islam and just went back and forth before he accepted Christ. So it takes time sometimes, and I'm sure you guys all have different people in your life that you've been discussing these types of things with for years and years and years, and just praying for them and hoping. And that is the Holy Spirit as well. We have to yield to the Spirit and allow him to work in a person's heart, because it's not my argument. If my arguments convince somebody, then we've done something wrong. It's ultimately on the Holy Spirit to change a heart, and that's what we want to remember. Any other questions or comments? All right. We're going to let Pastor be free. Let me close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Dear God, thank you so much for today, Lord. Thank you for these people who came out, and Lord, they heard your word. They heard this lesson, and thank you that they're thinking. Thank you, Lord, for their questions and their comments, and Lord, this discussion that we've had. What a blessing it is to be among your people. And God, I just pray that as we go out this week, you'd help us to shine as lights in the world. Thank you, God, that you've created us for a purpose, and that purpose is to show light of you to the people around us. God, I just pray that you'd bless our day, you'd bless our week, and that, God, you'd help us to be more like Jesus Christ this week. Lord, we love you, and we thank you for all you do for us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. You are dismissed.